Hi, this is the Magnificent Midlife podcast, and I'm Rachel Lancaster. This is where we celebrate women in midlife and beyond. We challenge the status quo and bash those negative stereotypes about being an older woman. We're not over the hill at 40, 50, 60. We're just getting started, and the world needs us now more than ever. I'll be talking all things midlife, about issues that matter, and sharing fabulous stories of amazing women doing very cool stuff. Now is our time. My guest today is Silke Herwald, and she's a grief specialist and hypnotherapist. I've talked about death before here, but not about grief, so I'm really pleased to be focusing on this today. So welcome, Silke.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to start by asking why you decided to specialise in helping people with grief.
So, I was running a general hypnotherapy clinic, and a lady came in and she wanted help with stopping drinking alcohol. And she was drinking 2 bottles of wine pretty much every single night. And I asked her, since when has this been a problem? And she could pretty much tell me exactly the date. And it was 2.5 years. And I asked her what happened. And she told me her husband had died. And so on the outside, she was functioning. She was going to work. She was having a career. Everything was working. But at night, she would just come home from work. And to numb the pain, she had just started that habit because it took the pain away and it allowed her to actually sleep. But now, after 2.5 years, she thought that she had an alcohol problem. But very quickly, I realized that we actually had a grief problem and not an alcohol problem. So I asked her permission and said, how would you feel that if we did something around the grief? Because I had the sense that without doing this, the symptom of the alcohol would not really go away. And so she absolutely agreed with that. And we started to work with the grief, with all the unconscious processes surrounding grief. And I was just fascinated with how well we actually were able to help her, because her biggest fear was, if I stop grieving, I will forget him. If I stop grieving, he will forever disappear and I will lose even more than what I have already lost. And said, okay, so what if there was a way that would work so that you could keep everything that is so dear to you really close to your heart, so that you still feel that you do have an ongoing connection with him and that you still have a relationship in some shape or form and that he's still part of your life, and you remember him, but at the same time not in that horrible pain anymore. And then we worked towards that. And of course then the drinking just went. We didn't really need to do much on it because it was all the grief. And then I was just fascinated by that. And then I started to really dig deep into grief and specialized in grief. Yeah.
That's a great story. That really is. That just really brings it home that often there are these underlying issues that we need to deal with, and that the symptom on the surface is just the symptom.
Yes.
And you have to dig deep, don't you, and find out what's really going on.
Yes, absolutely. And, I've had people who came in for weight loss, and the thing started 20 years ago when their mum died. But they just kind of have this thing about, I don't know, every afternoon they just need to eat these particularly bickies or whatever. And it's just what they did with mum. So at a very unconscious level, consciously they would never put 2 and 2 together. But to the unconscious, it helps them still feel connected. So there's all that kind of stuff going on unconsciously. And to me, that is just really fascinating, because the unconscious just kind of wants to make you feel better.
Yeah. We're going to dig into that in a bit. But I want to ask, why are we so bad at dealing with grief? I mean, I think some cultures are better than others, but sort of, I know you're in Australia and you're German in Australia and I'm British here in England, but our Anglo cultures are particularly bad, I think, aren't
Yes.
they? Or German's not Anglo, but it's
Same.
sort of
Equally bad.
similar.
Yeah. Yeah, I think kind of like our Western cultures are particularly bad with it. I think it is really, I think it's a product of how we have evolved culturally and as a society. And on the one hand, it is wonderful that we have modern medicine, but on the other hand, is part of creating this problem. Because in the old days, the babies were born in the village and the old people died in the village. That was just the way it was. So the dying grandparent was part of family life, because the dying grandparent was just lying in the living room, and that's where it kind of happened. And the kids would kind of, come in and run out again and witness the dying process. But now it is all removed to hospital, to hospice, to ICU. The kids, if they're lucky, they're allowed to go to hospital. They're hardly ever allowed in the ICU. They're practically never allowed in a hospice. And a lot of the time I even hear people say that, oh no, I wouldn't take my kids there. I don't want them to see him like that. I don't want them to remember grandpa like that. Well, yeah, they need to. They need to. It is really helpful for them. And if kids are lucky, they're allowed to go to a funeral. But I think because we have so sterilized the dying process. I mean, in our language, you hardly ever hear somebody say the person has died. They say they have passed away, they have moved on, they have transitioned, or whatever other stuff people can. But the truth of it is they have died. And I think that is part of it, that we have just really removed ourselves so much from that process. And then also we don't really know how to help a grieving friend anymore, because we've been trained that we need to help our friends feel better, that we kind of got to jolly them along. But in grief, there is no jollying them along. There's just sitting there and letting that person just be as sad and devastated and in anguish as they need to be. And once we realize that there's nothing we can say that'll make them feel better, that's a huge relief. It takes the pressure off. There's nothing anyone can say to make them feel better, and that's okay. They just got to be that.
There's lots of things that are coming up for me, and I'm hoping I can remember all of them, to mention them. One is about friends, is the list of things to not say to people.
Yes.
When someone's died. I mean, on a really silly level, somebody young said to me when my cat died recently that they're in a better place. And I thought, no, they're not in a better place. They're in a hole in the garden.
That's right.
And their better place was with me.
On my lap.
Frankly,
that's right.
It was with... on my, oh, she wouldn't come on my lap. She was a snotty little thing, but I loved her dearly.
Yes.
And her place was with me. So there's that list of things, isn't there? If you Google it, it's like things not to say. Oh. But also, just when I was a child, I wasn't allowed to go to my grandparents' funerals.
Yeah.
The two that died first. I think I was under 10 and I wasn't allowed to go. And that was to protect me. But yes. Looking back, I really think it was just so silly, because they were my grandparents, and I wasn't, it wasn't like I was going to look into the coffin or jump into the coffin and see them and be, disturbed forever. And even if I had, when people are in the coffin, they look very peaceful, don't they?
Yes.
That's the whole point of undertakers, that they make people look very peaceful. So I had this kind of disconnect. And it was, I've remembered it to this day. And then the other thing I just want to interject is that I've also been to the funeral of my then Chinese father-in-law. And that was unbelievable. It was
initially so uncomfortable because there was all this weeping and wailing, and I had to be fully dressed in white because, the
white.
whole family, and there was a big thing and all these banners as if it was a party, but it was actually a traditional Chinese funeral, and lots of firecrackers because every big life event has to be commemorated, and weeping and wailing and sobbing. And it felt so weird.
The overwhelm.
And yet, looking back again, I can see the power of that cathartic experience, that letting it all out, that acknowledgement of the grief, that wailing, that intensity of the emotion and letting it out. So I don't want to hijack your interview,
but it's great.
I've just been thinking about these things, and actually how the family could then move on. They had given so much to the grief of their loved one.
Yes.
And then they were able to say, I'm not being disloyal by moving on. He would actually want us to do that and all of that stuff. So, it was fascinating to have that difference of approach.
Yeah, and I absolutely love having those conversations about other cultures. So many other cultures just do grief so much better than we in our Western cultures. I was just talking to somebody from Zimbabwe, and she told me that it is the whole village comes, every family member, no matter whether it's like the third cousin, they all arrive. There is a spit roast. The body is in the living room or in the kitchen or wherever there is room. And then there is like a huge party with all of those people around the body. Everybody tells stories about the deceased person. It's kind of like also mandatory for fun things to happen. So that then that funeral experience is not just this horrible, sad memory, but also that thing where the kid climbed the tree and got stuck up the tree and couldn't come back down, and 3 men had to go and rescue it and whatever. So that there's also those fun things that happen as well. So I think it's really important.
I think that's changing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's changing in funerals, that there is more of a sense of celebration of a person's life now.
Yes.
But it's still very restrained. It's very the passion of the grief doesn't really have an outlet, I find.
Yes. Yeah. That's the wailing that you just described. I think that is brilliant.
So when somebody is paralyzed by grief, how do you start to help them?
So I always start at what is the one thing that will give them the most relief at that moment in time. And very often it's actually not working with the grief. Very often I call it almost like clearing the decks of the other emotions. So very often there is a sense of, I should have done this, I shouldn't have said that, I could have done more. Or that there's some kind of guilt. I should have sent them to the doctor sooner. I should have done this, even though logically they completely know that there was nothing else that they could have done. Or there often is like resentment towards maybe the medical practitioners, or there can be all sorts of other things that interfere. It could be guilt, resentment, anger. Quite often there's just massive overwhelm and anxiety about having to handle everything. And quite often I actually start working with those things first. Sometimes people kind of have got an endless internal dialogue with themselves where they are having arguments with themselves. I couldn't have done anything better, but I should. What if I had gotten to the hospital sooner? And then by just clearing that up, it actually allows the person more to actually be with their grief.
And how do you do that? How do you clear those things away?
How much time have you got? It is by working with the subconscious processes. So your subconscious is very much when somebody gives you well-meaning advice, and on the outside you're nodding your head and you go, oh yeah, no, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah, I'll try that. And on the inside, you've got this voice loud and clear that goes, hell no, no way, I'm not going to do that. No, I can't. No. That's your unconscious. And I help the person really tune into that subconscious and go, okay, so what's the objection here? What's the reason behind that you don't want to do that? Instead of kind of going, oh, that's crazy. You logically know that this would be the best thing to do. We can't work against the subconscious. So I just become curious about what the subconscious is actually trying to achieve by this and dial into that and help the person pay attention to their subconscious processes a lot better.
I have a dear friend, and I'm going to send her this podcast, and she'll know it's me I'm referring to when I make this comment. But a lot of time has passed for her, but she is still paralyzed by grief. I feel she is, and she will listen to me going blah blah blah, and I'm sure she's not really listening. And I know there is a lot of anger that she's holding. There is a lot of should have, whether it's from her perspective or the other. But there's also, I think there's a sense of that she'll be disloyal if she in any way moves on from her grief.
Yes.
That there's that disloyalty piece as well.
It's massive. It's so huge.
It's massive.
So that disloyalty piece is, if I stop grieving, that means I never really loved them. Or maybe if I'm in not so much pain anymore, then maybe I didn't love them as much as I thought I did. Or it will be disloyal. And that disloyal piece also comes in, for example, when after, I don't know, a few months, all of a sudden the bereaved person catches themselves having a smile or having a little laugh. And it's like they instantly whack themselves over the head and go, oh, how dare I? Right? And then they kind of go back into their grief. But of course, and sometimes consciously they kind of get that doesn't necessarily make sense. But for me, the important thing is that death ends a life, but it doesn't end the relationship. And that when we can find a way to actually grieve resourcefully so that it's not that awful, horrible, visceral pain that just throws you on the floor and rocks you to your core, but that we actually, through doing a resourceful grieving process, we can actually feel closer to our deceased loved one, that we can actually feel like they are in our heart forever, and that we move from this complete visceral pain into living a life that is inspired by them, that brings forward all the things that we love doing with our deceased loved one, that integrates everything that we loved with them, and so that we can actually live a life that honors them and that they are still part of in some shape or form.
I know you've talked about the sadness that when one life is lost, but then another life is lost to grief.
Yes.
Which I thought was really, really powerful.
Yeah. So I see that so often that I was working with somebody recently, and she said that she had lost her mum, and I assumed the mum had passed. And I asked her, so when did your mum die? And she said, well, my mum is still alive, but I lost my mum 5 years ago when her mum died. So
wow.
She says, honestly, my mum hasn't been the same since grandma died. She's not there. She's not present. When I was 16, she might as well died because she wasn't around. She was there. She was physically present, but I couldn't talk to her anymore. No matter what I said, it was always like, yeah, but my mum died. She was like, I was a 16-year-old girl. I needed my mum, but I lost her. And I thought that was so sad. So, yeah, I pretty much helped this young woman with the grief of losing her still alive mum to grief. So,
wow,
that was probably the most extreme case of losing somebody to grief. But other cases I have seen, of course, is trying to numb the pain with alcohol, drugs, but also anxiety, lethargy, not wanting to get out of bed, all of that kind of stuff. Because, hey, life is for, we have to live. And we can do that kicking and screaming, or we can learn the tools so that we can actually live in a way that most likely our deceased loved one would want us to live.
So I don't think you're a big fan of the 5 stages of grief, are you? What do you prefer? Why don't you like that, and what do you prefer?
So the reason why I don't like the 5 stages of grief, I mean, I think Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has done some amazing work. Her first book was on death and dying, and she came up with the 5 stages that terminally ill people go through. And then they try to take that same thing and put it on the grieving process. And that just really doesn't work. Because also, in the 5 stages, nobody talks about anxiety, about overwhelm, which are massive in grief. Yes, they never were laid out to be a linear process, but still people just kind of go, well, for example, I'm not experiencing anger, or I'm not experiencing depression. Am I doing it wrong? No, you're not doing it wrong. It's just not something that you happen to be doing. You do anxiety. It's far more complex than the 5 stages. There are so many more different emotions that are not even part of the 5 stages. And also the 5 stages, they kind of always land in acceptance. And I don't know, I mean, my sister died 4 years ago, my dad died last year. Yeah, I kind of have accepted that they're gone, but to me acceptance feels a bit too much like, okay, that has happened, what's next? And I don't think anybody who's grieving actually wants to get to that stage. What we actually want is to find a way to live life that they are kind of still part of and that honors them. So for me, for example, I've created a grief roadmap, and when I spoke to the graphic designer about it, I said, look, I need about 4,000 squiggly lines that go from the top to the bottom and left and right and round in circles and a few mazes and lots of dead-end roads in there. She said that wasn't going to happen, but hey. So yeah, but that is I think that really is what grief is grief is just exceptionally messy. There is no clear path forward, and there is definitely not a one-size-fits-all path. For me, it is always about helping the person find a way that they can grieve in their own unique way. And that is what the Grieve to Love roadmap is designed to do, is to kind of go, here are certain things that may or may not happen for you. And I just kind of wanted to warn you that if that happens, that's okay.
And you've talked about how people sometimes don't want to stop grieving. They just don't want to.
Yes.
So what do you say to them if you reach that stage where you've done some work, you've tried to help, you've given them thoughts and ideas, but they fundamentally don't want to stop? What do you then say to them?
Then I ask them, well, what would be even better than that? If they really don't want to, that's okay. Then there's not much I can do. But very often the reason that they come to see me is because a part of them does want some help. And it might not be that they don't want to stop grieving, but they don't want to be in that incredible, deep, visceral pain anymore. So it's okay, absolutely, to still grieve, but maybe not in that absolute raw, brutal force. So then we just kind of do work around just bringing that down a notch. I think most people I work with, they're still missing their loved one, and they're still, when an anniversary happens or something, they of course still remember them. And the way that I help people with their grief is very much so that most people just remember the horrible last memories, the person being very sick, or them being the dead body, or their decline, and they don't actually remember the entirety of that person's life. And I think that's kind of also not particularly fair to the deceased person, because they were a lot more than just that. They were a lot more than those last couple of weeks or months or years. And so then, through doing the work, we quite often get to the stage where they have lots of spontaneous memories. They might just be driving past somewhere and they see, I don't know, a sign or something, and it reminds them of something that they did 17 years ago and that I hadn't thought about in ages. And those are those living memories that then actually put a smile on their face, and where it moves more into a bittersweet sense of remembering, which is a nicer way to be, really. And lots of those memories.
That's very powerful. Yes, is to try and take it a bit further back,
Mm.
isn't it? And try and remember other things, not just the final.
Yes, exactly.
The final stage.
And I don't think that's fair to the deceased person. They wouldn't want that. They kind of go, hey, I was a bit more than that.
Yeah.
There was more to my life
Yeah.
than just that. So let's remember all of it.
So how can we as friends help a grieving person?
So at the very, very beginning, so just after impact, it's just be there. Literally just being there. And if you don't know what to say, just say, I actually don't know what to say, but I just want to be here. And that being there, surrounding that person, is really important, but also reading the room, taking the cues, just kind of go, look, I can be here. I'll just come over, make a cup of tea, sit with you. I'll be in the background. If you need to rest, that's okay. Very important. Simple things in grief. Everything is just so overwhelming. Just vacuuming the house becomes like this monumentous task that is really difficult. So people who are just a bit proactive and just kind of going, you know what, I'll just grab the vacuum. I'll just do the dishes. Just that kind of stuff. Super helpful.
Mm.
The thing is, though, that usually up until the funeral, everyone is there. After the funeral, 3 months later, 6 months later, remember the anniversary, remember their loved one's birthday, because those are really important days, and it is so sad then when nobody else remembers and you feel like you're the only person who still remembers that. It is just really, really helpful when somebody else says, hey, I know you're probably having a really difficult week. I know on Wednesday would be his birthday or is his anniversary. You probably won't feel like it, but how about we meet up this week, or we go for a walk, or you can just send a card, say, hey, I'm thinking of you. Those kind of things. Just remembering. And the other thing is sharing stories about the deceased person. Hey, I was there and I saw this thing and I thought he would have loved that, or your mum would have loved those flowers, or whatever. Just keeping the memory alive, because very often people say, oh no, I didn't want to talk about the person because I don't want to make you feel bad. Well, they're thinking about them all the time anyway, so it's not like you're bringing up something new. It actually makes them feel good that somebody else remembers them.
Yeah, we've really got to get over that avoidance, haven't we? Because I mean, I've heard grieving people talk about how people they know have crossed the road to avoid them because they just don't know what to say.
Yes.
And that's awful,
Yeah.
isn't it? That's awful for both, but it's terrible for the person that's grieving, that not only have they lost their loved one, but they've lost this person that they know because it's just too difficult to talk about the lost loved one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That happens so many times. Or that somebody says, 4 weeks later, and they may have even been the best friend, and they say, I was in so much shock, I didn't know what to say to you, so I haven't called you. Well, I suppose the widow was in a bit of shock too when that happened. Just saying.
Mm.
So yeah, it's just, honestly, forget all of that and just go, yeah, I'm here. I'm here. I'm coming over. And what a lot of people say is, hey, call me if you need anything. The person in the early stages of grief, they will never call because they don't even know what they need. They just in so much overwhelmed, they got no idea. So they're not going to call. But the people who are proactive and say, all right, I'm coming over. Think about, what did your person love doing? If they loved going for a walk, just go, all right, I'm coming over on Tuesday at 3 or on Thursday at 10, and we're going to go for a walk. That is really helpful, that proactive stuff.
And sadly, it is, I've found, certainly as I've gone into and through midlife, it is this stage of life where death starts to become more a part of life. And death is a part of life, isn't it? But and there are quite a lot of women who are widowed in their 50s. It's a surprising number, isn't it?
Yeah.
That is a whole new thing that we have to deal with.
Absolutely. And midlife is the time when we lose our parents. There's friends. And people, I always say also to my bereaved clients, I also say to them, look, the people who react in not a resourceful way, they just can't get it yet. They haven't been in the front row of a funeral yet, so they don't actually know what it's like. So I always kind of go for a forgiving angle because they just don't know. So because, I say, look, they might come around, give them a second chance, in this midlife age group is where we all of a sudden kind of go, oh, the interesting thing for me was that I was a grief specialist before my first proper grief really hit me. That was when my sister died 4 years ago. And I kind of had that weird experience of, on the one hand, being the grief specialist, but on the other hand, just being the little sister who just lost her big sister who'd been there from day one. It was just me who was grieving. It wasn't the grief specialist. But at the same time, I had that sense of like, oh, this, I knew it was horrible, but I didn't know it was like that horrible. So it took my understanding to yet another level, that grief understanding. And then, of course, my parents, who just lost her daughter, and I was like, oh, so that's what it's like for a parent to lose a child, even though she was a grown up. But and for her husband, it's like, oh, okay. And so once again, I had to go even deeper on my grief understanding at some level, probably for very selfish reasons, because I just couldn't hack the thought of losing one of my other loved ones to grief. For me, it was horrible enough that my sister had died. It was like, I can't now lose mum or dad or my brother-in-law to grief. I need to somehow find a way to help them through this. So yeah, that's what we did.
And did it help you to process your grief because of what you do?
Yes.
Or was it just too removed?
It did. I think the answer is a bit of both. On the one hand, it was removed, but on the other hand, I had helped so many people that I kind of knew that there was going to be light at the end of the tunnel. And just that knowing that there was light, that helped. I also knew that I had really good processes. So then at first I started to run myself through some processes, and that kind of worked. And then one of my best friends is also a hypnotherapist, and I asked her for help, and she said, yeah, I'd love to help you, but teach me. So I taught her those processes, and then she ran me through them, which then in turn also again helped me refine those processes, which was fantastic. So yeah, I think at some level I was removed, but at the other hand, it really gave me more understanding that I was going to get through this.
I think it's really interesting that you talk about processes, because often when we're overwhelmed about anything, having a process can ground, can't it? It can bring us back to just putting one foot in front of the other and not having to think so much. It's interesting. I think your processes can be really helpful, can't they?
Absolutely. And even things like rituals. So I often discuss that also with my clients, what rituals they could come up with. Because what works for me doesn't necessarily work for them. So I always say I don't really have any answers. I just have a lot of questions. And what helped me was I always would go down. I live close to the beach, and being on the east coast of Australia, the sun rises over the ocean. And I just loved going down to the ocean and watching the sunrise. Um, and I remember the first sunrise I watched, I almost felt insulted by it. How dare the sun rise again? Don't you know what just happened last night? Like, seriously? But at the same time, it gave me a wonderful sense of safety that even though my world has just shattered into a million pieces, that one thing was still the same. And that was kind of good. There was that constant. It gave me that sense of, yeah, something is still normal. And I would have gone down lots for a very long time. So there are other things that help people with their rituals. You know, my parents always had this lovely ritual of every afternoon they'd sit down together and have a cup of tea. My mum still to this day does it. Sits down every afternoon, has a cup of tea with Dad. You know, just sits there with his photograph and tells him about the day. And I think that's beautiful. And I think those kind of rituals and processes really help people, especially in the early days, to get some sense of normality, some sense of stability back.
I think that's a lovely example of actually, yes, talking to our loved one, because as you say, death doesn't end the relationship. And you know, some people may not believe that this has any credibility, but your loved one is always within you. So you can access them, you can talk to them, you can treat them as your inner mentor, whatever, that they're within you.
Yes.
Because your love holds them.
Correct. Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, and you know them so well. You know their mannerisms. You know, most likely, you kind of know what they would say to you anyway. And I was just recently, I had a thing at a leadership retreat, and I wasn't quite sure what to wear. And my sister was quite the styler and always super well dressed, and I inherited all of her clothes. And I was trying different things on. I just had a chat to her and I go, which top do I wear with these pants? What about this one? And I just saw her roll her eyes and she just go, please, no. I just laughed. I was like, okay, not that one. Which one then? And it was just such a really funny situation, because I just saw her rolling her eyes, and eventually I kind of had a white blouse and she go, can you please, these pants, you tuck the blouse in. And I was like, okay, right, I'll do that then. Thank you. So yeah, if you know your person well enough, you know what they'd be saying. And yeah, you can still have that relationship. I know that sounds totally crazy, and that's okay. I'm okay with that.
I think that sounds utterly beautiful. I really do. And I'm a great believer in the power of this. I mean, I'm often, talking to my clients about accessing their inner mentor. And there's no reason why you can't make your loved one your inner mentor and consult them.
Yeah.
I just really, and who cares if if other people roll their eyebrow or roll their eyes because you're doing it. If it helps you,
Correct.
It doesn't matter,
Yes.
does it?
Yeah, absolutely. That is so true. And I think also with that, it helps also with the loyalty piece. So, for example, my dad was an engineer and a master of a spreadsheet. And so when I flew over to Germany last year after he had died, and I was dealing for Mum with all of the banks and the insurance companies and all of that admin nightmare, I was getting overwhelmed. I couldn't keep track of at what stage I was with which insurance company and stuff. And I just kind of went, what would Dad do? And I was like, oh God, he'd do a spreadsheet, wouldn't he? So I did. I just made a spreadsheet so that I could keep track of everything. It was just that kind of, okay, good. Thanks, Dad, for teaching me how to do this. I always thought it was a bit ridiculous that you need to make a spreadsheet for everything and nothing, but I actually I can see the value in it. So, and I think that really helps with the I'm not feeling disloyal because I'm actually using everything that you've taught me, and I'm living a life that is inspired by all that.
Now, I'm interested that you are German and you've made your life in Australia. Have you noticed differences in how grief is processed between Germany and Australia, and how accommodating of the way you approach grief are the Australians, for example?
I actually think it's quite similar, but in Germany, it's so, for example, here in Australia, to have a celebration of life is a fairly common thing to be doing. So that the funeral quite often is just the close family, and then a few weeks later, a few months later, there will be a celebration of life, which involves all of the friends. And I think it's a really beautiful thing because then everybody just talks about the person and it helps keep their memory alive and so on and so forth. Whereas in Germany, it is more the traditional funeral, and then everybody kind of goes their separate ways, and the deceased is hardly ever mentioned again, which I think is really sad. But I've also noticed a huge difference, and that might be more of a societal structure thing, that in big cities, whether here or in Germany, is that very removed thing. But I also have got friends in outback Australia, so they'd be running cattle or sheep. They're really living on the land, and they might be, it might be 45 minutes drive to the neighbours. They have a very different relationship with death and with grief because I think they're so connected to the land. It seems more natural. So I found that interesting, and I think it will be really interesting for me to also explore whether, if you went to a rural area in England or in Germany, to a farming community, whether they would have a different relationship with it. That'd be very interesting to explore.
It would, wouldn't it? I do think that the more we get removed from the earth in our modern lives, it doesn't necessarily bring good things. Some things are good, yes, but other things are not. And I think that how we feel about and process death.
Yes.
As we started out this conversation, it's become so sterilized, hasn't it, by moving away from the earth, from Mother Earth, from the emotion, from the cyclical nature of life and all of that. We've taken it so far away from that, haven't we?
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. So that would be interesting to explore that a bit deeper.
So as we wind up, what would you most like people to know about grief, and how can they best move through it?
I think the most important thing is to allow yourself to really feel the feelings. I think the only way through grief is actually through grief. And that, in our society, we often get praised for, oh, she's so strong, she's holding up so well. I don't know whether that's a good thing. I actually doubt that that's a good thing, because that's just pushing it away and suppressing it. And those are the people who I see 15 years later, and they present with something completely different, and underlying, actually, it was grief. So the most important thing is feel the feelings, allow yourself to absolutely go there, and also know that you can grieve in a way that is not that horribly painful, and that you can still feel loyal to your person, that you can remember them, that you actually do. People always kind of think it's like, either I grieve and I'm in this horrible pain and I still feel connected to them because I mainly remember the last bits, or I stop grieving, I stop the pain, and I forget about them. It's not that at all. It's a combination of both. So it's completely possible to feel connected, to feel calmer, to not be in that horrible pain, to still remember them, to still get a little bit emotional, or get very emotional, but to kind of get through it. And then after a shorter period of time, you kind of go, okay, yeah, and you're okay again. That there is that hope that you don't have to be in that horrible, horrible state forever if you don't want to.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow, and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife, Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause, and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.